consider, life under Saddam Hussein, the wars against Iran, 1 million people dead, gas attacks against the Kurds by the Iraqis. Yeah, you might think, and a distinct people, a distinct language, you might think, they might want to have independence. So that's why you had such a heavy yes vote. So the areas of Iraqi Kurdistan, this is still part of Iraq, but they're controlled by Peshmerga, which is their Kurds army, is this red area. Then you've got areas that are controlled and claimed up in the north. The Iraqis, of course, they go around tearing down Kurdish flags wherever they can. So a year later, you can see ISIS is being pushed back. Now, if you look at a detail of it, the way the units deploy across the area is not uniformly, but there's Mosul. You can see the Kurds. You can see the Kurds and the Iraqis are pretty much faced off one against each other, and there's actually some Turkish army units in the north of Iraqi Kurdistan. But they face off against each other more than, here's some residual ISIS units down here in the river valley. The Iraqi army is faced off against the Kurds, not against ISIS, which is sort of curious. Now, today, the ISIS is chased out of Iraq. They no longer control territory. They're a terrorist threat, but they're not controlling territory. Let's look at Syria. Syria is even more complex. Syria is pretty big. It's about, you could fit, it's 6 of them in Ontario, but it's 90% the size of Great Britain, about the size of the state of Washington. Now, before the war, they had about 22 million people. Nobody knows how many people they have now, because so many have moved, become refugees, or been killed. Poor country, median age of 23. Now, when you've got half your population under 23, and again, red are women and girls, blue are men and boys, these younger generations, say from 15 to 35, what can young men who are 15 to 35, what are they very good at if they know nothing else? Carrying a gun, cannon fodder, being soldiers. They don't have a lot of people our age. A lot of the population was urban, 3 million people in Aleppo. An interesting thing about Syria is, again, we're talking about Sunni Shia, 60% are Sunni Arab, 12% of Alawite. Alawite is sort of a group of Shia. Bashar al-Assad, I think everybody's heard that name. He's the president of Syria. He's been in office for about 18 years or something like that. Which religion is Bashar al-Assad? Yeah, he's an Alawite. So, and the government is dominated by this little minority group of Alawites to the detriment of the great majority of Sunni Arabs. Now let's consolidate my chart a little bit. Sunni Arabs, 60%, but you take the small minorities, 18%, Kurds, 12%, and the Alawites. These groups might find common cause because they don't want to be dominated by the Sunni Arabs. They don't want to be dominated by the majority. Now, what's an Alawite? I said Alawite is a form of Shiism, but it's even more so because it's a sort of a branch of a branch. It has pagan elements, it has Christian elements, a lot of it is secret, and a lot of Arabs find this really offensive that the Alawites do not practice the 5 pillars of Islam. I mean, to a lot of Sunni Arabs, they would just find that staggering, that you don't practice the 5 pillars of Islam. They see them only as symbols, and they deify Ali. And remember, there's only one God but God. Muhammad is the messenger of God, and they're saying Ali is a God as well. Again, in the view of a lot of Sunni Arabs, that's a really terrible thing. So, a lot of this is stoking the conflict in Syria. Because now you can see the population is concentrated along the coast, the mountains. This is sort of desert out here, and then along the rivers, of course. Who lives where? You've got Sunnis across most of the country, Christians in the mountains, Alawites along the coast, Druze down by Israel. There are lots of Druze in Israel. Yazidis, a few Christians here and there. And the languages they speak, remember we were talking about Kurds over in Turkey, Kurds in Iraq. you've got Kurds across the northern part of Syria. A little bit of Aramaic, some Turkoman. Now, Syria was part of the Ottoman Empire into World War I. Syria, Lebanon came under the French. Next door, Iraq and Palestine came under the British. The French during World War II, they were Vichy French in Syria, and so Syria had to be occupied by the Allies. It was the Australians of all countries that liberated it from the Vichy French. The Allies quickly withdrew. They gave the country independence, and all foreign troops were gone by 1946. For a little while, Syria united with Egypt. They called it the United Arab Republic. There you see President Gamal Abdel Nasser addressing the masses in Damascus and all that, but that didn't last. And so by 1971, they'd had a coup in Syria, and an Air Force general by the name of Hafez al-Assad became president, dictator, if you will. He's an Alawite. Remember, Alawites are very different from other Shia, much less Sunni. And Hafez al-Assad, you recognize the al-Assad name, and yes, he's related. He's the father of the current president. They quickly began a long, rich tradition of crooked elections. You always knew who was going to win before the election was held. They did send troops to Saudi Arabia to help bring down Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War. And here's the ruling family of Syria. Now in the back row, you've got his son Mahir. He was the commander of the Republican Guard. Bashar, who is actually an eye surgeon in London. I don't know if you've ever been to Western Eye Hospital. 20 years ago, he could have been your ophthalmologist. Married to a British citizen, in fact, of Syrian origin. And then the heir apparent right here, the heir apparent Basil. What went wrong was Basil was a bit of a fast driver and liked raced fast cars, fast women. He died in a car crash. And then, so they brought the eye surgeon back. And so when Assad died, his son took over. So you've got Bashar Hafez al-Assad, went to medical school, Western Eye Hospital, ophthalmologist, married to a British citizen of Syrian origin, and they've got 3 kids. Now, he continued his father's policies of meddling in Lebanon, such as assassinating the prime minister, continued his father's policies of an alliance with Syria. Remember, Syria's Shia also. There he is with Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the guy that says the Holocaust never happened. And so when the Arab Spring rolled around and there was protests, as there were across the Arab world, Hafez al-Assad did not take it well. They overreacted quickly, violence escalated, and within a couple of months, you had this. By November, Syria was suspended from the Arab League. Remember, they're very unpopular, they're Alawite. It wasn't they were offended by what they were doing to their citizens, it was rather that they were Alawites. 3.5 years later, you had the Syria civil war really rocking and rolling, creating large numbers of refugees. You had areas across the north controlled by the Kurds, huge areas of the interior by ISIS, the sort of the salmon-colored area by the government, and then green by different rebel groups. Of course, the people that always suffer the most are the civilians. Literally millions of people, a couple of million people in Syria, of Syrians in Turkey, another million in Lebanon, another million in Jordan. In the West, they say, well, that one country or another might say they would take 10,000 refugees. There are millions of people in the countries around. There's something outside of Syria, at least 5 million people that have fled the country, 500,000 killed, 7 million that are still in the country, but they've had to move within Syria. And maybe a little less than half of the people are still in their homes. Now, why would anybody support Assad? Well, there are very good reasons to support Assad. You've got the other, first of all, he and his family, they have to stay. If they're out of power, they're dead, quite literally. They have to stay in power or die. The Alawites, they're only 12% of the population, but they certainly support him, partly because They're getting the goodies, those which exist in a place like Syria, of power, and they fear payback from the rest of the population if Assad ever goes. Hezbollah is from Lebanon, but they're also Shia. They're a terror group, ties to Iran. They're supporting very much because of its support from Iran. A lot of Christians and Druze, they're a little bit more nuanced, but they fear Sunni dominance. And then, of course, Iran. So, in fact, Iran has even sent different, that they've controlled militias from Iraq, from Lebanon, into Syria to help Assad stay in power. Okay, remember, these are all Shia groups. Most of the rebels are Sunni. So Shia helping Shia, coming in from Iraq, coming in from Lebanon. So military support from Iraq. You've got the Syrian Arab Army, dominated by Alawites. Now, some of the rank and file soldiers can be anything, but the officers are going to be Alawites. Iran, which is Shia. Hezbollah, Shia. Iraqi militia, Shia, and then Russia. Now, why Russia? We're going to come around to that in a second. Here's Putin in a visit last month at a Russian air base in Syria. Now, you got ISIS here. Think of this as a map, stylized map. Iraq is over here. Syria is over here. You've got Kurds in the north. ISIS, smaller and smaller. They still have a little bit of territory in Syria. Different Syrian rebels, multiple groups, and then Iraqi Sunnis. Everybody is helping. They're getting lots of help from everybody else. You've got everybody's against Iraq. Everybody is against ISIS, or at least claims to be. But you've got the Kurds in the north being helped by Iran. Even though the Kurds are Sunni, they get a bit of help from Iran because they're fighting ISIS. Iran certainly helps the Syrian government because it's Shia helping Shia. The U.S. is helping the Kurds because they're actually a sort of like a semi-democratic force, and they're fighting ISIS. The U.S. helps the Iraqi government, helps non-ISIS Syrian rebels as well as Syrian Sunnis directly. The Saudis are helping Syrian rebels. They don't seem to get too much help to the Kurds, though, and Iraqi Sunnis, because Saudi Arabia is a Sunni power. Now, and I added this actually just this morning when I was reviewing this talk. Turkey actually gets its own flag on this chart now because they have actually moved in or occupying parts of Syria, in some cases supporting Syrian rebels, in some cases just going, and this is the so-called Operation Olive Branch, that's mainly directed, though, against Syrian Kurds. So then if you're looking at everybody involved, you've got all sorts of different flags of different groups, but the point being is a lot of it is Shia versus Sunni. Now, Kurds. You've got different Kurds in Syria than you do in Iraq. The Kurds in Syria, they have not declared independence. No Kurds have declared independence. That would be too dangerous. But they call themselves Rojava. Now they say, oh, we're not really Kurds. We say we're Kurds, but we're also Arabs, Assyrians, Turkmen, Christians, everything like that. Turkey says they're a bunch of terrorists, and that's why Turkey is moving into some areas west of the Euphrates rivers. They hold elections, they elect local councils, they have their little flag, they call themselves democratic. They're very much supported by Britain, France, and the United States. Here they're actually occupying the old ISIS capital of Raqqa. That was about 2 or 3 months ago, moving in. And I don't know if it's a measure of feminism or whatever, but they have a lot of women carrying guns as well. They say we believe in the equality of women, which is unusual in that part of the world. Your battle zone maps are in the Middle East around this area are bizarre. This is the battle for Deir al-Zur. You've got ISIS here, you've got the Iraqi government coming from this side, the Kurds from this side, Assad from that side. The Kurds and the Iraqis supported by air power from the west, Iraq, supported by air power and bombing strikes by the Russians, is a very complicated thing to keep everybody from not having any more battles than they do. So here's what Syria looks like today. You've got the Kurds up here north and east of the Euphrates River. Turkey's occupying the area west of the Euphrates, oftentimes at the expense of the Kurds. You've got this area out here, which is the former Al-Nusra Front. HST is the abbreviation, HTS. Some people say they're Al-Qaeda, actually. Other people say they're not. The US it's sort of this mishmash of groups. The U.S. has supported some of the mishmash, others not. Areas here controlled by by Assad, other smaller groups controlled by other Syrian rebels. In other words, they've got. So you still have some residual areas controlled by ISIS. You've got the real makings for another 2 or 3 years of misery, fighting, people getting killed. Iraq, you've got a more inclusive government that's been pushed into place. Hopefully Sunnis will be peeled off away from ISIS. The possibility of a deal in Syria looks pretty slim, so they just can't end the war. You've got different sides checkmating each other. Let me mention Russia for a moment. There's a Russian soldier with his helicopter. You've got flankers, you've got a lot of Russian bombers, bases in Syria. Now, why would in Syria, why would Russia care? You think of Russia, this is a Russian fishing boat. This is very much a Russian Orthodox place. Actually, most Russians aren't religious at all, and you do have a lot of Russian Orthodox, but you've got a huge number of Muslims in Russia. Maybe 1 Russian in 6 is Muslim, particularly concentrated here in Tatarstan, as well as down in the Transcaucasus. And Russia has its own domestic terrorist group. They're trying to start a Islamic caliphate in the North Caucasus. There's just a steady series of bombings and terror attacks across Russia, even airport bombing. Usually 300 or 400 people killed. This is inside Russia. These guys are battling in the mountains. And most recently, in December of 2017, it's not secret, it was in the news, there was a big terror attack planned in St. Petersburg at Christmas in a cathedral. The people from the Transcaucasus wanted to kill hundreds of Russians in church at Christmas, and the only reason it didn't happen, at least according to the Russians, was the CIA tipped them off and helped them out, and they were able to nip it in the bud. So Russia feels they have a stake in this because they feel they're fighting terrorism as much as anybody else. There's also Russian nationalism, assertiveness, and a Putin factor. Now, consider what's happened in what's happened in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon over the past, say, 14, 15 years. Who's the big winner? Is it Putin? Yeah, probably not. Who's come out ahead? How about Santa Claus here? The big geopolitical winner, no, that's not Santa Claus, that's Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And here he is with some of his Revolutionary Guard leaders. What's happening is sort of an arc of Iranian influence forming across the Middle East, not including the Kurds, by the way, but certainly Iraq's Shia-dominated government, Syria, certainly with Assad, an Iranian ally, parts of Lebanon that are actually controlled by Hezbollah. You think of terrorist groups as guys hiding in houses and coming out at night. They actually control territory in Lebanon. Now I'm going to briefly talk about Libya. Libya is really big. You could fit Texas about 4 times into Libya. It's about the size of Alaska. Came under control of Italy, actually, about 1911, kicking out the Ottoman Empire. And in 1969, Captain Muammar al-Gaddafi, soon to be Field Marshal Gaddafi, took power. There you can see him with the president of Italy. There's one of Gaddafi's bodyguards. Took power, a very quixotic, very strange leader, had his green book, dabbled with chemical weapons, WMD, gave those up, and then there was a bombing campaign supported by the U.S., but it was really the British Royal Air Force and the French that brought him to heel. And of course, in 2011, Gaddafi retired from public service permanently. So what do you have when you have a country that you had no civil society, no democratic tradition, no rule of law? Remember, I began by talking about rule of law. What do you have then? Well, of course, you have a civil war. And so you've got two competing governments supported by countries on the outside. The U.S. is not really taking sides in this one so much, but Turkey's government on one side, the Tripoli side, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the Tobruk side, and different areas of the country. Again, you've got the so-called dignity